All right, good afternoon, folks. This is your video lecture for Thursday, March 21st. I hope everyone's doing well. Let's pick up with where we left off last time around. So when we left off last time, we had been discussing slide number 40 in your slide decks. I'm not going to put all the slides up here because most of the relevant text I will discuss over the course of the lecture, but you're welcome to follow along if you want to. It should be pretty clear where we are in the deck at any given point here. So as you remember, when we left off around slide 40, we had been discussing this idea of consciousness as something not just that's physical, but as something that's specifically representable as a physical symbol system. That is, as a combination of a set of symbols and then rules for manipulating those symbols. And we, of course, tied this back to the idea of the physical symbol system hypothesis with Newell and Simon, and then brought that back to all the way back to Alan Turing and the Turing test, with the Turing test being basically an argument for a behaviorist theory of intelligence. That is, that the Turing test tries to characterize whether or not something is intelligent entirely in terms of how it acts, how the thing behaves. The physical symbol system hypothesis then says, so all you need is a physical symbol system, a sufficiently complex symbol system, the right kind of symbol system. That's enough to provide real intelligence, and indeed intelligence consists of nothing other than such a system. Then we saw the response to that in John Searle's Chinese room experiment, right? So Searle looks at this and he says, hypothesize a room, there's a person inside the room who has rules for manipulating Chinese characters. That is, he has a symbol system, and yet cannot make any sense of the system. He doesn't understand the characters. He doesn't attribute any meaning to them as he reads them. All he does is he matches the symbols that are slid into the room against the symbols written in his books, and then based on that, he returns a new set of symbols outside. And what's Searle's point in all this? Searle is arguing that this is precisely the position in which a computer in the Turing test, or a computer in general, finds itself. You may view your interaction with the computer as watching a lecture on YouTube, or browsing Twitter, or any number of other things, playing a game of chess, talking to a chatbot, whatever it might be. But to the computer, all of these activities reduce down to it saying, here is a pattern of ones and zeros that I take as input, here's a pattern of ones and zeros that I produce as output, and it has no sense of the meaning of those patterns of symbols. All it can make of them is that they are patterns of ones and zeros, and that it produces them in accordance with some set of rules, that is, with the programming of the system. And so Searle here is taking aim at the behaviorist theory of intelligence. Searle's point here is to say it is not enough merely to have a system that behaves in the proper way. It's not enough just to have behaviors that look correct, or to say, well, we have a set of rules and symbols that produce something that acts human-like. Searle says that there is something beyond this that's necessary, and the necessary step is some idea of comprehension, right? So tie this back to what we talked about last week on the subject of intentionality. You remember the idea, right? Intentionality says that the weird thing about our thoughts, the thing that so far as we can tell is unlike anything else in reality, is that our thoughts have a content. Our thoughts are, in some meaningful way, about the things that we think. And so when an actual Chinese speaker holds a Chinese conversation, his thoughts, when he hears the words in Chinese, he thinks about those words, about the meaning of those words. In other words, those words convey to him some sense of intentionality, some sense of aboutness, or of the idea that there is a meaning to the other person's utterances. He considers that meaning, and he produces a response according to that meaning. He says something back to them. Searle's critique is that the physical symbol system by itself provides nothing of that sort. The physical symbol system does not have any meaning. In a very real sense, the physical symbol system, or the Chinese room, does not understand Chinese. And Searle says, look, This idea of meaning, of comprehension, of there being some kind of aboutness or import to the things that are said, to the symbols that are processed, this is the fundamental defining feature of what it is to be human and to have human interactions. And any theory that we propose that omits that, that says, here's intelligent behavior, but that doesn't cover the idea of aboutness, of intentionality, anything without that, says Searle, is fundamentally deficient and has at a most basic level, has missed the boat as to what we're trying to do. Now, I think it's important to note here that Searle is not a theist. Searle is not going to argue that there is some kind of both a body and a soul, or even a body and a mind, as two different things here. A famous John Searle quote is, "The mind is what the brain does." In other words, Searle believes that your brain produces your mind as some kind of higher level process. So his metaphor is something like this. He says, look, if you look at a pattern of atoms, atoms by themselves are not solid, liquid, or gas, right? You can't look at one atom and say, that's a solid. One atom doesn't have solidity. Solidity is about patterns. It's about interactions in the atoms that together they're arranged in a grid or some kind of crystalline structure or something else where the arrangement of the atoms produces solidity. In other words, to say something is solid is to say there's a higher level property arising out of the lower level properties. You put all the atoms together, you get something that's an emergent property there, and that's solidity or liquidity or whatever it might be. Searle argues that the same thing happens with consciousness. He says, look, I can't look at any particular neuron in your brain, or even at all the neurons individually, and find consciousness there. Instead, he says, consciousness is something that emerges from higher level patterns within the brain. So some combination of neurons, something about the way they're all structured causes them to add up into something that produces consciousness. But consciousness is still very much a material process. Changes to the brain change your consciousness because the brain produces consciousness in the same way a pattern of atoms produces solidity, or at least in something analogous to that. And so I don't want to sell Searle the wrong way here. He's not going to argue against the idea that that consciousness is a physical phenomenon in general. He is specifically going to take aim at this idea that that the physical symbol system captures everything that there is to be said. You can find a useful quote there on that next slide where Searle says, look, I will argue in the literal sense that the computer understands exactly what the car understands and what the adding machine understands, right? Picture even an abacus here fits with his metaphor. What does the abacus understand about what it's doing? Ultimately, it understands exactly nothing. And he says that's exactly what the computer is. He hedges this a little bit ultimately in his book. He allows for the possibility that there may be some special arrangement of a computer that might produce consciousness in the same way that the arrangement of your neurons in your brain do. But he says whatever it is that does this, it's not something evident just at the level of a Turing machine or of a physical symbol system. That's an insufficient level of description. There's got to be some higher level properties that fall out of this. Now, I would quibble with Searle a little bit at this point. In particular, I think Searle is more of a philosopher than he is a computer scientist. And I'm not sure the degree to which he would agree with the assessment that there's really nothing to a Turing machine beyond the things that we talked about in class the other day, the states, the rules, etc., that everything else can be boiled down to a machine in that description, and that there cannot be any features that are not capturable by that description. I'm not sure how much he would agree with that, but that is at least where he lands on this position. So a second problem, a second critique that's made of the entire concept of a behaviorist description or of a purely symbol-based manipulation comes back to this idea of qualia, right? So you remember we discussed qualia the other day. Qualia are just a way of describing sensory experiences. So when I say that I touch an object and it has a particular feeling of roughness or smoothness, when I say that there's a particular way that it feels to see a color or to have a particular smell or taste, all of these would be examples of qualia. They are some sort of sensory experience, not merely the physical attributes of the object in question. In other words, we don't reduce qualia down and say, qualia are just the nerves that fire, or the particular electrical impulses, or radiation, or matter that produces some pattern in my nervous system, but that they are necessarily the experiential component of the whole thing. And there's a lot of fun thought experiments that can be done with qualia. So here's an interesting example on that subject. So there's a thought experiment that runs something like this. Let's suppose that there are two men who both grew up working in a coffee factory. They drank this coffee every day of their lives, and then at a certain point, they both moved away and stopped drinking coffee. 20 years later, the two men reunite, they move back to the town, and for the first time in 20 years, they each have a cup of this same coffee that they used to drink every day. Both men raise their cup, both men take a sip, and then in unison, they both spit the coffee back out. The man to the left says, "Oh, this is terrible. It doesn't taste anything like it used to. They must have changed it somehow. The taste is wrong." And the man to his right says, "Oh no, it tastes exactly the same. I have exactly the same experience of tasting it. It's just my tastes have matured over the last 20 years. I can't stand this anymore. I don't know how I ever managed to drink something that tasted like this." And the riddle is this: which of the two men, if either, is wrong? Now, how could we ever prove which one is wrong? We could look at the coffee involved and we could chemically test it and see whether it is the same substance as it was before, right? But let's suppose that it passes that test, that chemically this is exactly the same compound that we had previously. So it's not like the company has changed formulae in the last 20 years. How then do we decide which man is right or wrong? Well, it may be that they're both correct, that to the one man, the sensory experience is exactly what it was before. To the other man, the sensory experience is something different. We don't know that the sense experience has to be exactly mapped to the chemicals and so on that come in. The experience might be to some degree independent of that. We just have no way of proving this definitively one way or the other. If this is something of interest to you, if you'd like to read more about some of this problem of matching our conscious experiences to the physical phenomena that produce them, there's an entire field of this called psychophysics, so psycho like psychology, psychophysics, that is all about how different physical phenomena interact with corresponding psychological phenomena. So for instance, how much more light, how many more photons of light do we need to emit from a light bulb before my subjective experience, my qualia experience of it, is that the light bulb is twice as bright as it was before? How much change is required there in physical terms? Psychophysics is all about studies of that form. All right, so what does this matter to the current conversation? Well, again, you can see that the problem here is that the Turing test, the Chinese room, one of the problems that the Chinese room has is that there is no qualia-like experience of the man inside the room. Another way of putting this is this. Let's suppose that you are blind from birth. You have no experience of sight, and yet you are a student of optics. You have studied color theory and the structure of the eye and the way that the brain processes sight. All of that you have spent your life studying, and you know everything that there is to be known about these different processes. Everything about the wavelengths of light, about the structures in the brain, about the interactions of light on the eye. Everything of that form you have studied exhaustively, and you know everything that there is to be known about these processes. Does it follow then that you know what it's like to see the color orange? In other words, do you have the qualia experience of seeing the color orange? Now, this is a hard test to run But in general, people would answer that question, no. There remains something that you don't know from all these physical experiences, and that's that you don't know what it's like to actually have the experience of seeing a particular color. Until you actually have that experience, you're missing something. And so the argument then runs that a purely physical description, a purely behaviorist description, that all it can talk about is which atoms do what and what energy passes where. Such a description is necessarily missing something about the conscious experience, namely it's missing the qualia. So a lot of this comes out of the writings of Thomas Nagel, the author of Your Mind and Cosmos textbook. And Nagel, one of his other famous pieces, is a paper called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And Nagel runs basically this hypothetical experiment where he imagines not that you are blind and studying sight, but he imagines that you are studying bats. Again, you know everything there is to be known about a bat's physiology, and yet at the end of that process, you're still lacking something. You're missing the experiential character of the thing. You don't know what it's actually like to be a bat. You cannot describe the feeling of the wind between the membranes of your wing, right? You cannot discuss the profound joy of a mouthful of juicy bug, or exactly what it feels like to hear your sonar bounce back to you, right? You may be able to describe these things scientifically to a very high degree of precision, but you have no actual experience of them. And so Nagel speaks against the characterizing of consciousness in functional terms. That is, he says we cannot describe conscious behavior purely in terms of what it does, in terms of either the internal mechanical changes or in the actions that you take because of your conscious behavior. He says both of those miss that. Fundamentally, says Nagel, you know, we can describe things in these terms. He says, I don't deny that mental states cause behavior. In other words, he says the things that you're thinking consciously, those certainly do affect what you do. They certainly do have functional characteristics. They change the kinds of things that you do. I only deny, he says, that this exhausts the analysis of them. Anything that wants to do away with mental states, with consciousness, with experience in general. Anything that wants to reduce that out, any reductionist program, he says, has to start by looking at an analysis of what it is to be reduced. In other words, he says, look, the fundamental question is, what are our conscious states? Where do they come from? And if you're going to pitch me some kind of answer like the physical symbol system hypothesis that gives the answer of, oh, well, they don't matter, let's just brush them aside and ignore them, you have denied the fundamental thing we were trying to study. You cannot defend materialism, he says, with any analysis of mental phenomena that doesn't deal with the fact that they are subjective. That is, that they have an experiential character that only the person who experiences them is actually aware of. Now, there are basically two responses to Nagel's argument. One of them comes from a fellow by the name of Daniel Dennett. And Dennett wrote a paper called Quining Qualia. Now, Quine comes from the name of another famous philosopher whose name is Quine. Quining, in this sense, means the elimination of a thing, or the cutting away of an unnecessary thing. And so Dennett wants to do precisely the thing that Searle and Nagel are critiquing here. That is, Dennett's argument is to say that qualia are unnecessary to our understanding of consciousness. Dennett would look at something like the coffee experiment I described a few minutes ago, and he would say, look, there's the proof. We can't tell which of the two guys is correct in their qualia because their qualia don't actually matter. Their qualia don't change anything in the analysis. The only thing that matters to the analysis is their behavior, that is, the function of the things that happen because of their mental states. And so when Dennett would describe your mental state, he would not describe it in experiential terms. He would describe it in functional terms. Let me try to put that this way, right? So here's a functionalist description of pain. Pain is the thing that causes you to clutch your arm and go, ow, 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 right? It is defined in terms of what it causes you to do. That is a functional characterization of the thing. Functionalism, which is Dennett's philosophy, is then the idea that when I describe your mental states, when I describe your consciousness, that I describe it purely in functional terms, that is, purely as interactions between different states that cause you to act in different ways. And then these ineffable, these private experiences that you have that are really hard to describe to anyone else, this aboutness, this qualia, fundamentally argues Dennett, these things either don't exist or they're basically irrelevant to any understanding of consciousness. Again, Searle and Nagel are going to speak very heavily against this, right? This is exactly what Nagel is saying on the previous slide, what he's speaking against, to say, look, you've solved the problem of consciousness by saying, well, let's pretend it doesn't exist, right? You have explained away the entire thing that we're interested in talking about. And then you've kind of shrugged and said, oh, well, good. Now the problem's easy. Now there's no more work to be done. Everything makes perfect sense in purely material terms. Searle then responds and says, look, if we're going to take a purely materialist answer like this, an answer that says there is nothing but the material interactions in your brain and the material behaviors that you have coming out of that, we have denied the phenomenon of study. In other words, we have denied the very thing that we're here to try to look into. And I say this is totally unacceptable. Any theory that explains consciousness has to start by acknowledging consciousness, by admitting that there really is some kind of experiential quality to study. And if we're not going to take the Dennett style response, then, if we're not going to do that, we have to then say there is something else happening here, something beyond purely the symbol processing layer. So what is that thing? Well, again, one possibility here is that it's still something physical. Just because something can't be described as a physical symbol system, right? Just because it can't be described in terms of mathematical symbol manipulation doesn't mean it can't be a physical thing altogether. There are all sorts of physical phenomena that are uncomputable, or at least that we have no clear way of computing. So it's not clear that just because we've defeated the one idea, if we look at that as being defeated, it's not clear that just because we've defeated that, that consciousness still can't be a physical thing in general. Again, this is basically Searle's position. Mind is what the brain does, and that consciousness then arises from some interaction of the lower level components of your material brain. Okay, so what is this other thing then, right? Because fundamentally what we have to say is this. If it can be described in symbol system terms, then it can be described by a Turing machine. In other words, then it can be processed and produced by a computer. If it's something that cannot be represented as a symbol system, then it's something non-computational. And fundamentally that means, well, if it's non-computational, there can be no computer program for doing it. And so strong artificial intelligence, right? Real human-like artificial intelligence, come back to our original topic. Real strong AI must then be impossible because strong AI cannot capture whatever this incomputable thing is. Again, we're relatively okay with saying there are things that are not computable. We've talked about this before when we discussed Gödel's incompleteness theorem, right? We know that there are things that cannot be computed, not as some kind of technological limitation, the computer's not big enough or fast enough, not as some kind of restriction on we just haven't figured out how to do it yet, but fundamentally because some things simply cannot be computed. Simply mathematically, there can exist no computation for these things. And again, if consciousness is such a phenomenon, then necessarily there can be no such thing as strong AI. On the other hand, if this something else is computable, if it's just some weird arrangement of a computer, right, some weird structure of the computer chips, or something that falls out of maybe we need to use a biological material for the computer, who knows? But if it's something of that form, something about the computer's arrangement, well then all right, then strong AI might at least theoretically still be possible. Again, I have concerns here that anything that is computable should be reducible down to just a very simple symbol system. In particular then, so if you'll join me on slide 49 here, we have here our illustration of a Turing machine, right? This is our basic pattern. I'm not going to go through this again, but fundamentally, you can trace the operation of a Turing machine by writing down the pattern of symbols somewhere, much as the string that I have here is written down. Write down that pattern of symbols, just record it on a sheet of paper somewhere, draw out the Turing machine on a sheet of paper, and then trace the behavior of the Turing machine by putting one finger down in whatever state of the machine is the place where you currently are, right? Remember that at every moment within the machine, it's got to exist in one of those bubbles, those states that are numbered off on the page there. And so that's all a Turing machine is. He's your finger down on one bubble to mark where you are right now, your pencil on the string of characters to mark where you are in the string of characters, and over time you move backwards and forwards in that string and shift from bubble to bubble. Any computable process can be represented in exactly that form. Your laptop can be represented in exactly that form, provided that you have enough bubbles, enough strings, enough space to write the thing out. It would be enormous, but you could do it. And any strong AI must fit that same pattern. Any strong AI we can conceive of has got to be representable as some pattern of bubbles and arrows and then some string written off to one side of them. And so here's the riddle. If conscious phenomena can somehow be produced by, if experiences, that is, can somehow be produced by a Turing machine, then it follows that conscious phenomena can be reduced down to moving from some bubble in that machine to some other bubble. Right? So think about that. I'm tracing out the machine by hand, right? It's written out on paper. I've drawn it out for myself. I've got a finger down over here and a pencil down over there. I'm just marking where I am in the machine. And I say, okay, time for the machine to experience pain. And I mark out a couple of characters over here, and I slide my finger over to a different bubble. Is that at all a sensible thing to say? Oh yes, whenever I put my finger in this bubble right here, the machine experiences pain. Does that even on the surface of it feel like a reasonable thing to say? It seems crazy, right? That doesn't seem like it possibly could be the end of subjective experiences to say, I just slide my finger between these bubbles for a while, and there, every time I do that, whoops, the AI experiences pain, because all the AI is me tracing out the program by moving around the page on the paper here. That seems crazy. And yet, if strong AI is possible, if an AI really can experience qualia and have these kind of subjective experiences, it must necessarily reduce down to precisely that. And if that seems nuts, if that seems like bits can't possibly add up to experience in this way, right? That just moving from one bubble to the next cannot possibly produce some kind of subjective experience, well, then that's precisely the problem. That's precisely the issue that strong AI has. Now, there's a straightforward response to this. And the response goes something like this. Okay, fine. You think it's nuts that sliding your finger from one bubble on this Turing machine to another would produce conscious experiences. But I can describe your brain in exactly those same kinds of terms, right? Shouldn't it seem equally nuts that releasing a little bit of this chemical, adding a little bit of chemical to the mix, adding some electricity over here, that's enough for conscious experience? Doesn't it seem nuts that that would produce that kind of qualia or something? If again, it's just physical descriptions and then some experiential change happens. If the one computer-style description seems like it shouldn't produce experiences, doesn't it seem like the other description should as well, or shouldn't as well? And I think that's a fair critique. I think that's a fair critique. But I think the question then becomes, so do we buy that that's all there is in your conscious experience is some change in chemicals or electricity? Or do we look at that and then say, okay, then that suggests there's something more than the purely physical, something more than the biochemical that's producing your experience as well. In other words, the problem seems to be that this is not a sufficient description, either the mathematical or the biochemical, to account for our actual consciousness. And if it's not enough to explain qualia and aboutness and all the rest, then what does? So there's a philosopher here by the name of David Chalmers who writes about this extensively. And Chalmers says that all discussions of consciousness break into one of two categories, what he calls the easy problems and the hard problems. Now, the easy problems, he says, are kind of misnamed. They're actually still extremely difficult. You could plausibly spend your entire life working on one easy problem of consciousness, because the easy problems are things like, how is it that we store things in memory and then recall them at a later date? Or how is it that sleep and waking are such drastically different states of being? They feel so different, or not that they feel so different, but the brain functions so differently in them. How is it that brain activity translates into fine-grained control of your body? He says all of these are difficult questions to answer, and yet they all fall within the easy problem of consciousness. Why? Well, because the easy problem of consciousness is fundamentally anything that boils down to a question we can phrase as, how do we do X? They're always, how do we accomplish something statements? How do we do memory? How do we do motor control? How do we do vision? And to answer a how do we do question, we can provide that answer purely in functionalist terms. So to explain vision, I can explain vision purely in terms of interactions of light and the retina and the visual cortex of my brain and whatever other relevant features there might be. All of the easy problems admit to a functionalist description, a functionalist answer to them. But the hard problem is the problem of experience. It's the problem of where these qualia come from. And so Chalmers says, it's undeniable that some organisms are subjects of experience, but the question is, how these systems are subjects of experience? This, he says, is perplexing. Why is it that when our cognitive systems engage in visual and auditory information processing, we have visual or auditory experience? In other words, the idea is this: you could give me a description of the retina and the brain and all the rest of that, and you could maybe give me a description there that ends in my reacting to things that I see, but no part of that description will include the step at which I have the actual subjective experience of seeing the color blue or recognizing that there's an obstacle in my way that I need to navigate around or something like that. No part of that description that's purely physics and electricity and biochemistry and so on, no part of that purely biochemical description will ever mention the fact that there is a corresponding experience. And so Chalmers says, so how can we explain why there's something it is like to entertain a mental image or to experience an emotion? How do we explain why there's something that these things feel like? It's widely agreed that experiences arise from a physical basis, but we have no good explanation as to why it arises from a physical basis. Why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should. Like any account of this, that should not happen. And yet it does. And indeed, it's basically the central aspect of our experience, right? The core feature of what it is to be human is that we do have these experiences. And yet there's even a bigger problem here, right? So this is a core problem for a purely physicalist, a purely naturalist explanation of consciousness. If you're going to try to explain all of reality in purely material terms, if you want to say there is no spiritual, there's nothing beyond matter and energy and their interactions, you fundamentally have to explain the experiential character. And what Chalmers argues fundamentally is that there currently exists no such explanation. He says, look, some people look at this like Dennett, and they deny that there's anything there to be studied. They just say, there is no such thing as experience. It's something your brain is just programmed to declare that it has these experiences, but meaningfully they don't exist. Other people will look at it and they'll say, something weird and quantum is happening here. And Chalmers likes to laugh at this and to say, it's not really clear why they connect quantum physics to experience. He says, I don't see that there's any connection between those, except that quantum physics is really hard and confusing and not many people understand what's happening with it. And experience is weird and confusing and not many people understand what's happening with it. And so when you have two weird and confusing things, surely they must be connected to each other somehow. He says, that seems to be the end of the story there. But a real explanation for this, a real material account that can actually explain why biochemical processes should produce experience, simply does not exist. That's not me putting my theist hat on. That is simply the best state of the art in any science that we have today. There is nothing even approximating an answer to the hard question of consciousness, nor is it even clear what form such an answer could conceivably take. In other words, we don't even know what an answer like that might look like. We can't even conceive of what an answer to the hard problem might be. And yet, as I say, there's even a bigger problem remaining. So let's return to your readings from Mind and Cosmos here. Nagel, as we've said, Nagel is at least agnostic, if not an atheist. I think Nagel would probably self-describe as an atheist there. And Nagel, nonetheless, points to the current purely naturalist understanding and says, there seems to me to be a fundamental problem in our typical description of the world. So Nagel says, look, let's start with two assumptions that he says are basically universal, basically omnipresent in science as a whole today. The first of these assumptions is what we will call physicalism. So physicalism is the idea that the only thing that exists is the physical universe. There is nothing beyond the physical universe. No such thing as mental materials, no such thing as a soul or a spirit. Anything that is must be describable in purely physical terms. Now, you may have heard this called materialism. Again, the idea that everything is made of one material, which is very similar to this. We distinguish materialism from physicalism because there are alternate theories of materialism that say the mental is all that exists and there is no physical layer, right? That's still a claim that everything is made of one material that just changes what that material is. If you remember our discussion of idealism from a few weeks back, right? Idealism could be seen as a kind of materialism that just says the mental material is the only thing that exists. Well, physicalism goes a little bit more specific than that. It asserts that the physical material is all that exists. So there's number one. There's our first assumption. Our second assumption is unguided natural evolution. Now, the unguided here is important because remember, what does evolution do? Well, unguided evolution fits a very simple pattern. Unguided natural evolution has a very straightforward objective. It has the objective, as much as we can speak of it having an objective at all, which even that is kind of an anthropomorphism that's probably not deserved here. The only thing that is done through unguided natural evolution, let me say it instead that way. The only thing done through unguided natural evolution is this. Species change over time to optimize their chance of reproducing, right? Of surviving and then producing young who then pass their genes on to something else. Everything that exists optimizes to perform those two tasks. Nagel starts by saying, basically everyone in the scientific community accepts those two things are true. And the assumption of those two properties produces a problem when we come to consciousness. Why? Well, look, if physicalism is false, it is very easy to explain where consciousness comes from. Right? If we do not assume physicalism, there's an easy answer to the problem of consciousness, and the answer is, aha, consciousness is some kind of non-physical property, some kind of weird mental juju substance that's hooked up to my brain, so there's still some kind of interaction there, but it's made of something other than matter, and so it's not governed by evolution, right? That's the easy answer if we deny physicalism. Modern science, modern secular science, basically universally is going to reject that and say, no, everything that there is arises out of the physical. There cannot be any separate mental substance. So whatever minds are, they are what they are specifically because brains are the way they are. Now, I want to be a little bit careful as I say this, right? I want to be careful to say, even if you accept the supernatural here, as I would, even if you accept the supernatural, we have reason to show humility in our discussion of conscious phenomena. We do not know exactly what the relation between mind and brain is. The Bible doesn't tell us that, right? There's no explicit statements to that effect in Scripture. And all the things that we discussed in the earlier parts of this chapter, all of that physical evidence that says changes to your brain produces changes to your consciousness, none of that disappears with any of the objections we've raised. Somehow it still has to be accounted for. So I want to urge some humility as we consider this part here. Nonetheless, I think there is room to say that if consciousness is non-material, if as Christians we do accept that non-material things can exist, right? Namely that God is non-material, right? The Father is not a material being, that matter is created of him, not that he is made of matter. If we're going to allow for the possibility of non-physical material in the first place, then we have to allow at least the possibility that our consciousness could be as well. And if consciousness does prove to be non-material, well, then any purely material exploration of it is doomed from the get-go, right? Anything that operates on the assumption that consciousness must be physical has missed the boat already and just has no chance of reaching the right conclusions. But let's set that aside for a moment. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that physicalism is correct. Let's assume, in other words, that conscious behavior is, and that conscious experience is a physical phenomenon. Well, then where does it come from? Well, it comes from the same place everywhere else does. It comes from my physical body, namely from my brain. And so it follows then that whatever processes produced my physical body also produced my consciousness, right? I mean, that's how that has to work. If my consciousness is a purely physical phenomenon, then the things that shaped my physical being also shaped my consciousness. And here's where Nagel's second assumption comes in: unguided evolution. And the critical bit is the unguided part of this. That is, nothing sat down and said, I am going to shape evolution so as to produce conscious beings. There's no plan, there's no destination. Evolution cannot and should not be treated as a thing with purposes or goals or plans. This is a very tempting thing to do. So Richard Dawkins writes about this in his book, The Blind Watchmaker. And Dawkins says, look, as evolutionary scientists, it is very tempting to discuss evolution in these kinds of terms as if it was trying to get somewhere. And Dawkins says, you've got to fight that temptation. There's no long-distance target, no final perfection to serve as a criterion for selection. Evolution has no mind and no mind's eye. It does not plan for the future. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. And thinking about it in anthropomorphic terms is fundamentally unhelpful and will lead us to the wrong kinds of conclusions. Okay, so what? So the point is this. The point is to say that if my body is shaped by unguided evolution, and so likewise my consciousness is shaped by unguided evolution because my consciousness is physical, then my consciousness was shaped without any kind of plan or desire or a long-term view or anything like that, right? Nothing ever sat down to create my consciousness. Nothing ever intended to give me experiences and so on. These things are purely a side effect of evolutionary processes. All right, so what are those processes? Well, think about what unguided evolution does. It asserts basically the following things. First off, there exist organisms in the world, right? There are critters out there that live. Second, these organisms have descendants. They have children. Third, they pass traits to those descendants. So there is heritability. Fourth, here's the natural selection part. Some organisms have traits that make them more likely to survive. So some organisms are going to have more children, or their children will survive better, or something will cause them to reproduce better than organisms with different traits. And then fifth, there's got to be some way that organisms gain new fitness-enhancing traits. So some kind of mutation process, some means by which these organisms gain additional traits so that new, better traits can be introduced into the pool, right? You've got to have a system of that form. You've got to have that, or you do not have any way of evolving past your current point. Okay, so we've got this system. So here's the riddle. What is this system optimizing for? We've kind of already answered this, right? What is this system optimizing for? It is optimizing for organisms with the particular combination of traits that lead to better survival and reproduction rates, right? I mean, that's all there is at the end of the day here, is organisms with better combinations of traits where better is defined purely in terms of survival and reproduction. Organisms with those combinations of traits multiply, organisms without those combinations of traits die. And I want you to see what that description is. I want you to see that that is a purely behaviorist description of results, a functionalist description of results. In other words, what we have is a system that optimizes for certain kinds of action: reproduction, finding food, finding shelter, finding mates, right? A system that encourages these kinds of behaviors. Organisms with the right kinds of behaviors survive, organisms without die. These are purely external descriptions, right? They are purely descriptions given in terms of what the organisms do. Purely functional descriptions. That's the problem. Well, the problem is that the interesting features of consciousness that we've just been discussing are not functional, right? I mean, that was our entire point in the preceding discussion, is that qualia, all the rest of this stuff, is not a functional thing. It cannot be described in purely functional terms. Behavior is not the thing I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is my internal states, my internal sense of the world. And the question is, so what does unguided evolution care about my internal states, about my internal sense of the world? It doesn't care at all, right? I mean, it really doesn't matter what I think about the world as long as I act in the proper ways. So, you know, I may or may not realize that I'm eating a delicious sandwich, right? What matters is that my body moves in such a way as to eat the sandwich. That's the only thing that's important. That's the only thing that unguided evolution can select for, is sandwich eating behavior, right? It cannot select for the belief that I'm eating a sandwich, for that to line up, for that kind of experience, for that kind of aboutness. That has to be an independent thing. Now, again, I'm not trying to say that that behavior is irrelevant, right? That behavior doesn't matter to your fitness. What I am saying is irrelevant is your internal narrative, right? So definitely we want an organism that when it gets hungry, it eats a sandwich. That's desirable. But what's not needed is for that organism to think to itself, have the internal subjective experience where it says, oh, I'm hungry. I should go eat a sandwich. That's unnecessary. All we need is the right light to travel through the eye, and the electricity fires in the brain, and the chemicals run down the hands that make the nerves fire, that make the muscles move, that pick up the sandwich and put it in my mouth. That's the only bit that's necessary. I don't need to have, for survival purposes, I don't need to have the internal narrative of what I'm doing, of why I'm eating the sandwich. And even if I do have an internal narrative, there's no particular reason I need that narrative to line up with what's actually happening. So maybe my perception right now is that I am recording a video lecture on YouTube, right? Maybe that's my sense of what I'm doing. That's my internal state of what's happening. Unguided evolution doesn't care about that. Unguided evolution would be fine with saying, you can think you're doing that, but what's actually happening is you're running from predators right now. And just your body is taking care of that all on its own. Your mind has no idea what's happening there because there's no particular reason your mind should be lined up with what your body's doing. You see what I'm saying? There's no particular reason that my internal state of the world and the actual external state of the world ought to line up with each other. Now, often about this point, somebody will pause and say, wait, but I mean, if you are running from predators, wouldn't you expect that your brain causes you to think that you're running from predators? And certainly that's our experience, right? Is we think that our internal states of the world match pretty well to what's happening in the world. When that doesn't happen, we'd say that somebody is hallucinating, right? That they're seeing things that aren't there. We think it's fairly important that our internal states of the world line up to the actual physical world, and most of the time, as best we can tell, they do. But there's no particular reason that ought to be true, is there? I mean, if unguided evolution is just selecting for my behaviors, it has no real interest in causing me to accurately think about the things I'm doing. It just wants me to take the proper behaviors in response. Maybe somehow an entirely wrong understanding of the world is the thing that would produce the right kinds of behaviors, right? Maybe for whatever reason, right? My brain's being wired together by random mutations. Maybe somehow those random mutations do produce conscious experience, but that conscious experience is nothing like what's actually happening to me in the world. It's just that happens to be the random firing of neurons that produces some random floaty experience up here when I'm doing some kind of survival-oriented behavior. There's no actual connection between the two. So our sense of having an inner world that matches up to the outer world, our sense that these two things align, there's really no survival-oriented reason why they should. So Nagel says this, it is prima facie, it's on the face of it, highly implausible that life as we know it is a result of a sequence of physical accidents together with the mechanism of natural selection. He says, it boggles the mind that a series of random accidents producing a survival-oriented organism like us would also, just by chance, by pure coincidence, would also produce a brain with all of these weird, we call epiphenomenal, so kind of irrelevant mental states, right? Just happens to produce all of these mental states. And by pure coincidence, the mental states line up with what the organism is actually doing. It boggles the mind that by chance, that internal world should happen to line up with the external world, when the only pressures involved are ones selecting for external behavior. Don't care at all about the internal states. He says that is absurd and ridiculous. We should speculate that that's what's happening to us. And yet, if we start with our two opening assumptions here, right? Physicalism plus unguided natural evolution. If we begin with those two claims, we're left in a position where that's exactly the world in which we seem to find ourselves. We have internal states, we have an external world, we have no particular reason to believe that these two correspond. Now, I want you to see an example of exactly this kind of failure to correspond here. So I will put in the YouTube description here a link to the video that's also in your slides. It is on slide 70. I'd like you to go ahead and pause this video where we are here and go ahead and watch the video that's linked there, because what you will see in that other video is an example of an organism whose internal and external states do not match each other, and yet his behaviors produce exactly the kind of survival-oriented behavior we're talking about here. Ready? All right, go ahead and pause the video here. I'll be waiting for you when you get back. All right, everybody back? So let's talk about the pyro. So what can we say about the pyro? Can we say that the pyro exhibits fitness-enhancing behaviors? Well, yes. He avoids predators, more to the point, he sets them on fire, right? Fairly effective as a survival technique. Do the pyro's internal states line up with his external reality? Well, no, they don't. He thinks he's in the happy gumdrop kingdom. Actually, as noted before, he's setting everything on fire. There is no correspondence between the two. Should he trust his internal mental states? Well, I mean, he's unaware of this, but we as the objective observer can look at this and can say, no, he absolutely should not trust his sense of what he's doing internally, right? He shouldn't believe that that's accurate because we can tell that it's not. We know that his internal and external states are very different from each other. And so the things he thinks he's doing are not the things he's actually doing. And why then should we believe that our internal and external states line up any better than the pyros do? Well, there's no clear reason that we should, given our two starting points. And yet, if they don't, right? If we have no particular reason to believe that our internal and external states match, then we have no reason to trust any conclusions based on our observations of the world, because all those observations are predicated on the hypothesis that our internal states are a real description of a real external world. If we think it's plausible that the external world is nothing like our internal world, exactly the case that we would expect to be the case given our two starting points here. If we expect that our internal and external worlds do not match, that calls into question every conclusion we reach based on our observations. In other words, we have to abandon basically all of scientific endeavor because it's all based on the claim that the internal and external worlds are going to correspond, that we're observing real things when we observe the world around us. And if that's the case, if there is no such correspondence, we can't trust any of our reasoning about the external world. Do you see how this is self-defeating, right? We start with a series of observations about the world. From those observations, we conclude physicalism and unguided evolution are true. Based on that, we conclude that there's no reason to believe our internal and external states match each other. And based on that, we no longer trust the observations of the world that got us to this position in the first place, right? We are left in a place where we're required to say we no longer have reason to trust the things that started the entire chain of logic in the first place. We say then that this is self-defeating, that the very argument that gets us here ultimately denies itself. It ultimately says, and if I'm right, you shouldn't trust me about my conclusions. Nagel says on this, the problem has two aspects. The first is the likelihood that the process of natural selection should have generated creatures with the capacity to discover by reason the truth about a reality that extends vastly beyond the initial appearances, as we take ourselves to have done. So first he says, and this is again kind of the cognitive niche problem, right? He says, why on earth should we believe it likely that evolutionary pressures should enable us to understand the world around us in a deep and reliable way? But second, he says, the second problem is the difficulty of understanding naturalistically the faculty of reason that is the very essence of these activities. In other words, above all, the thing we have to question here is, why should we trust our own reason when reason, as an internal sense, has no particular reason to be reliable, given that the only things that should be reliable are behavioral, are external? So then, three questions. Why should we have consciousness at all? Why should brute matter produce conscious interactions and senses of an internal world at all, except as a pure coincidence? Second, why should we trust that that consciousness corresponds at all to the outside world? Why should we trust that there's any kind of matchup between the two? And third, why then should we have any capability to understand that world and to reason about it and to form an internal sense of what's happening in that world when all that really matters is that we take the right kinds of behaviors, right? Again, think about how utterly remarkable our understanding of the world really is. Think about the depth and breadth of our understanding of it, that we are able to do mathematical proofs hundreds of lines long, touching on purely abstracted objects, that we're able to analyze our world at a level of detail where we can look at molecular levels that are purely invisible to the naked eye, or to consider objects so much vaster than our own world that they boggle comprehension, right? None of these assisted us at any point in our survival in the past. Most of them would be incomprehensible outside the extremely recent past, certainly far too recent to have any kind of bearing on our evolutionary trajectory, right? We cannot have evolved the ability to do science. It's simply too recent of a phenomenon. Why then did they emerge if they didn't matter? And even if they did matter, how can we possibly trust their results? Now, I think it's interesting to see Nagel's response to this. Again, Nagel is not an atheist, but or is an atheist, I should say, is not a theist. But he very graciously, I think, at this point pauses and he says, look, one thing must be confessed, and that is that the theists at least have an explanation for this. He says, the theists understand why there should be mind in matter, and why mind and matter should line up with each other. And their explanation is that mind came first, which is basically correct, right? What's the first thing that exists in the universe? God, right? Even beyond the universe, the first thing that exists, period, is God. God is without beginning. God is not made of matter, but certainly God does have a mind that is in some way, right, in some incomprehensible, immeasurable way, but is in some way still similar to the minds that we ourselves have. And so God, from a theistic perspective, God creates a material universe. Mind comes first, matter comes out of that, and then minds are situated within matter because of the action of that original mind, the mind of God. So mind comes from mind. Mind ultimately is prior to matter in the theist understanding. And so Nagel says, I cannot accept this position, right? I'm not able to accept theism as a perspective. He says, I just have no sense of the divine that people talk about, right? I have no sense of there being anything more than this world. I'm unable to accept theism as a possibility, but I will at least grant the theists this. They have a consistent story of where mind comes from. And the non-theists don't. So I told you a few weeks ago that I was going to kind of take this in turns, right? That if you were a Christian, that the section on evolution maybe is a little bit difficult for you, where no matter where you fall on the question of origins, that it's still an awkward fit, right? Either the science is awkward or the scripture is awkward, but something there is not a great fit with the evidence we have in hand right now. We have answers, we can appeal to those answers, but they're not as clean as we might like them to be. And I said, okay, so you may be a non-theist at this point, and you may be saying, well, simple answer, drop theism and the problem disappears. So here's the flip side of that. Here is, I think, one of the central problems facing non-theistic perspectives today. And if I were a non-theist, this would be one of the things that would keep me up at night, is to say, how do we explain the experiential character of the world? And how do we explain our high level of trust in that experiential character? Why do we believe that our understanding of the world is reliable when the best non-theistic explanations of material reality basically require that it should not be? Basically require that the overwhelmingly most likely possibility is that we are all madmen locked in our own little private mental cells, and none of us have an accurate sense of what's actually happening in the world around us. If you're a theist, I think there's some comfort in this, right? If you are a theist, I think there's some grounds here to say, maybe this is not the first ground of support for your theism, but I think there's some comfort in looking at this and saying, here's a question that the best and brightest minds today do not have an answer for. And we have one. There's one provided to us, right? We have an explanation of this that makes sense. Look, I think all Christians pass through periods of greater faith and greater doubt. Certainly that's been the pattern in my own life, right? There are days when you're writing in pure confidence in the faith, and there are days that you struggle and say, am I backing the right horse here? Is this Christianity thing, is this really legitimate? Is there any reason to hold the faith that I do have? And I think this is one reason to answer that question in the affirmative. To say, this isn't just a matter that there's a gap or there's an unexplained piece of evidence somewhere. This is something where the only existing answer to the question that really seems to address it, the only thing that really provides an evidentiary answer to it, seems to be the theistic position. And for me, at least, that is a comfort sometimes. When I find myself struggling with questions of faith, the fact that there is an evidentiary answer to go back to and to say, look, you gotta explain consciousness somehow. If you're not willing to take the step of faith of theism, you have to take a step of faith to explain this some other way because you've got no scientific answer for it. I think that is a comfort. Nagel basically owns this. Nagel basically acknowledges this as a weakness and says, something is drastically wrong in our comprehension of the universe. Something about the standard materialist story of the universe is very, very wrong at a very basic level. And he doesn't really know what that might be, what it is that's broken. He says, the best guess I have as to what's broken here is that the universe is in some way biased towards consciousness, that somehow at a very fundamental level, something that's low enough to shape the course of evolution on Earth, that somehow the universe is built in such a way that it produces conscious life where its internal and external states correspond. Somehow that's just baked into the fundamental nature of reality. And then he just kind of throws up his hands and says, I have no idea how that could happen. I don't know how the universe could be biased towards consciousness. I don't even really know what that would look like, but it's the best explanation I have. That's a statement, from my perspective, that is a statement of pure faith, right? There's got to be an answer. Maybe it looks like this. And that's the best that there is. That is the state of the art in answering this question. And so I think we have a case here to assert that there is good reason to believe that consciousness is something beyond the material, right? That consciousness is something non-materialistic in its nature, something that has as a property some sort of other substance. Mental, spiritual, maybe it's the mind, maybe it's the soul. I don't think we've shown enough here to give a conclusive answer to that. Although, again, working within a framework of Christianity, we might argue for a particular answer within this. But I think at a minimum, we have enough evidence here to say it is a reasonable conclusion on purely evidentiary grounds that there must be something beyond the physical and that this something else explains where conscious phenomena come from. I think, in other words, there is ground at this point to say that the mind and the soul, and ultimately that God, make sense from the evidence as presented. We'll pick up from that thought when we come back on Tuesday.